Today, I want to talk about something that rarely gets named in leadership conversations, but quietly shapes teams, cultures, and results every day. It's not ego. It's not arrogance. It's not bad intent. It's the toxic trait no one talks about in leadership. And chances are, it's one you and I have both encountered, maybe even in ourselves. Most leadership conversations focus on what to add: more skills, more tools, more frameworks, more confidence. But leadership doesn't usually break down because something is missing. It breaks down when something is overused. The toxic trait no one talks about in leadership isn't cruelty or incompetence. It's unexamined strength. Many of the traits that help leaders advance early in their careers can begin to create friction once those leaders have more responsibility and influence. Decisiveness can turn into control. High standards can turn into chronic dissatisfaction. Accountability can turn into micromanagement. Ownership can turn into bottlenecking. What's important here is intent. These leaders aren't trying to create strain. They're trying to be responsible. They care about outcomes. They're protecting quality and momentum. And that's exactly why this pattern can be so difficult to notice. It lives inside good intentions. The word toxic carries a lot of weight. So instead of naming the pattern directly, we soften the language. We say, I'm just very hands-on. I move fast. I have high expectations. I care deeply about quality. All of those things can be true, and all of those things can still have unintended impact. A trait becomes toxic, not because it's bad, but because it's out of context, out of proportion, or out of awareness. When leadership patterns start to create friction, there's often something consistent underneath: a desire to feel steady through control. Control of outcomes, control of decisions, control of pace, control of perception. This isn't a flaw, it's a strategy. Many high-performing leaders learned early that stepping in kept things moving, protected standards, and reduced risk. That approach worked for a long time, until the role and the system required something different. Psychologists refer to this as the shadow side of strengths. In leadership, it often looks like this. Decisive becomes controlling. Reliable becomes overfunctioning. Visionary becomes detached. Detail-oriented becomes perfectionistic. Supportive becomes people-pleasing. The strength itself isn't the issue. The issue is when the leader doesn't have flexibility in how or when it shows up. Teams notice this quickly. Unchecked leadership patterns don't usually create dramatic dysfunction. They create subtle but meaningful shifts. Teams share fewer ideas. Decisions move upward instead of outward. Initiative decreases. Innovation slows. Energy fades. People begin to comply rather than fully contribute. And leaders often respond by becoming more involved, reinforcing the pattern without realizing it. They're not stepping up, so I step in more. Internally, this feels practical. Externally, it can feel limiting. Leaders don't always receive clear feedback about these patterns, not because people aren't thoughtful, but because feedback flows differently in systems with hierarchy. People tend to emphasize strengths. You're very driven. You care a lot. You have high standards. What often goes unsaid are the downstream effects. There's not much room to think. It's easier to wait than to try. We're not sure where we have ownership. By the time these dynamics surface clearly, momentum has already shifted. Leadership growth at this level isn't about changing who you are. It's about expanding your range, being able to ask, is this trait helping right now? Or is it familiar? Am I adding clarity or filling space? What happens if I pause instead of stepping in? This kind of work doesn't show up neatly on a performance review, but it's where leadership capacity actually expands. If you want to reflect on this more deeply, consider these questions. Where do decisions slow down without me? Where do people defer instead of decide? Where do I feel tension when outcomes aren't in my hands? What feedback do I tend to reinterpret instead of explore? These questions aren't about judgment. They're about insight. And insight creates choice. Early leadership is about competence. Mid-stage leadership is about execution. Advanced leadership is about self-regulation. At higher levels, leadership isn't about doing more. It's about knowing when your presence helps and when it changes the system in ways you may not intend. One of the most useful leadership questions isn't, "What should my team do differently?" It's this: "What trait of mine is shaping the conditions I'm responding to?" That question isn't about blame. It's about agency. And when leaders start there, leadership shifts from authority to awareness, which is where sustainable influence grows. If this conversation resonates, it's because this level of leadership matters. Building teams that think like leaders doesn't start with more oversight. It starts with leaders who think first about their impact, their patterns, and the environments they create. Thank you for joining me on the Deliberate Leaders podcast. I'm Allison Dunn. If you want to explore this work more deeply, I invite you to reserve your copy of my upcoming book, Think First, Build a Team That Thinks Like Leaders. It's a practical guide for leaders who want to stop being the bottleneck and start building cultures of ownership, thinking, and deliberate leadership. You can reserve your copy now at deliberatedirections.com/thinkfirst. Thanks for listening and for doing the kind of leadership work that shapes strong thinking teams.